El Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México se enorgullece en presentar la Conferencia Magistral Mechanism Design, How to Implement Social Goals. Nos honra con su presencia el Dr. Eric Maskin, Premio Nobel de Economía 2007. Nos acompaña en el Presidium el maestro Mario Martín Delgado, secretario de Finanzas del Gobierno del Distrito Federal. El doctor Alejandro Hernández, director de la División Académica de Economía, Derecho y Ciencias Sociales del Instituto Tecnológico Autónomo de México. El doctor José Germán Rojas, director de la Licenciatura en Economía. Y Jorge Manuel Galván, representante de los alumnos de Economía del Instituto. Con ustedes, Jorge Manuel Galván.
Good afternoon, Dr. Maskin, and thanks for coming to ITAM. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. Hola compañeros, bienvenidos esta tarde, que sin duda alguna nos hará reflexionar y actuar en el futuro en correspondencia con las actividades que se están realizando en la representación junto con el Departamento de Economía del ITAM. Les agradezco mucho su presencia aquí, a ustedes, que sin duda alguna sin ustedes esto no sería posible. Los profesores y las personalidades que están aquí en el presidio. Y simplemente, no quiero tomarme un buen rato aquí para reflexionar e invitarlos a hacer cosas, sino simplemente para decirles que critiquen, que participen, que actúen en su carrera, que actúen en su universidad. ¿Por qué? Porque esta es la mejor universidad del país y ustedes son gente privilegiada. Los invito a criticar y a participar. Muchas gracias.
Ahora con ustedes, unas palabras del doctor Alejandro Hernández.
Eric, welcome to ITAM. It's a privilege to have you with us. Queridos alumnos, muy buenas tardes. Es un día de gala para nosotros. Les voy a contar lo que les comentaba a mis alumnos hoy en la mañana en clase. Es siempre un motivo de enorme felicidad y de privilegio poder escuchar uno de los grandes economistas galardonados con el Premio Nobel, pero hay de galardonados a galardonados, ¿no? Y el que tenemos este día es un Premio Nobel del tamaño del universo. Es uno de los grandes líderes de nuestra disciplina, de los grandes pensadores, que ha abierto brecha en un campo de enorme importancia. Todos los que hemos dedicado parte de nuestra vida a estudiar la teoría económica tenemos una enorme admiración y respeto por Eric Maskin, y es de verdad un enorme orgullo y una gran satisfacción que esté aquí. Es una persona además que es un buen amigo del instituto, ha venido varias veces, debo admitir que es la primera que viene desde que es Premio Nobel, pero ha estado aquí con nosotros, nos ha acompañado, así que nos da mucho gusto recibirlo. No quiero entrar en muchos detalles de lo que vamos a escuchar más adelante, pero diseño de mecanismos, se preguntarán muchos de ustedes, estudiantes jóvenes, ¿y eso qué es? Ya lo escucharán, pero bueno, significa preocuparnos por aquellos momentos, aquellos entornos económicos en que la aplicación de nuestro dorado primer tribunal de bienestar no se aplica, en donde no necesariamente el resultado de la interacción competitiva de los mercados nos lleva a un óptimo social, quizá porque dicha interacción es imposible o quizá porque no se dan las bases necesarias para el entorno. Hay problemas de información asimétrica, hay problemas de barreras de entrada, y en ese caso nos podemos preguntar cuáles son las mejores instituciones, cuáles son los mejores arreglos para lograr lo que se busca, ya sea desde el punto de vista, por ejemplo, de un empresario que busca maximizar ganancias o de encontrar los mejores arreglos para la sociedad. De ese tamaño creo que es la contribución de Eric Maskin y del resto de grandes mentes que fueron también galardonados junto con él en el año 2007 por la Comisión Nobel. Especialmente debo mencionar a Leo Hurwitz, quien desafortunadamente ya no está con nosotros, y Roger Myerson, quien también hemos contado con su presencia innumerables veces aquí en el ITAM. Eric Maskin nació en la ciudad de Nueva York. Toda su educación fue en la Universidad de Harvard, su educación formal fue en la Universidad de Harvard como licenciado en matemáticas y probablemente doctorado en matemáticas aplicadas. Profesor en MIT y en la propia Universidad de Harvard, donde llevó a cabo la mayor parte de sus estudios. Desde el año 2000 es miembro del Instituto de Estudios Avanzados en Princeton, un instituto que, si no lo conocen, desde los años 30 es un centro independiente que ha juntado a las mentes más brillantes con un sentido multidisciplinario, historiadores, matemáticos, físicos. Albert Einstein, por ejemplo, fue miembro del Instituto de Estudios Avanzados, lo mismo que Robert Oppenheimer y que muchos otros, Kurt Gödel, quien más les menciona, John von Neumann, por supuesto, ¿no? Entonces, realmente es un lugar espléndido, que donde desde el año 2000 Eric Maskin es miembro. Es fellow de la Academia Americana de Artes y Ciencias, por supuesto fellow de la Sociedad Econométrica, donde fue presidente en el año 2003, y bueno, ha recibido múltiples honores, doctorados honoris causa, fellowships, etc. De manera que no digo más, los dejo. Antes de ello, quisiera hacer un reconocimiento muy especial a un muy querido exalumno y amigo del ITAM, Mario Delgado, y agradecerle por su conducto al gobierno de la Ciudad de México y de manera muy especial al Instituto de Ciencia y Tecnología del Distrito Federal por patrocinar este evento. Muchísimas gracias, Mario, es la segunda vez que nos... De verdad nos sentimos sumamente halagados que cada vez que el gobierno del Distrito Federal trae una figura de este tamaño pienses en tu querida alma mater. Muchísimas gracias. Sin más, los dejo. Eric, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here in ITAM again and to receive such a very warm welcome. Very nice indeed. This afternoon I thought I would tell you a little bit about what I've spent so much of my career on, which is the theory of mechanism design. I will first try to give you a very short definition, a few-minute definition, but definitions are never really adequate. So the best way of understanding what mechanism design is all about, I feel, is to see it actually used. So I will go through a few examples, 3 examples, which I hope will illustrate what the theory is trying to do and how it tries to accomplish its goals. So, first of all, the one-sentence definition. In my view, mechanism design theory is the engineering part of economics. So, as I'm sure you know, much of economic theory concentrates on taking existing economic institutions and trying to predict or explain the outcomes that those institutions give rise to. This is what is called the positive or predictive part of economics, and I would say it constitutes maybe 90% of what most economists do. But I'm actually interested in the part of economics which is just the opposite. That is, in mechanism design, we do things the other way around. We start with the outcomes. We start with outcomes that we would like to have. Those are our goals. And then we ask, what kinds of, well, first of all, whether one could construct institutions, build institutions or mechanisms that would achieve those goals. And if the answer is yes, then we want to know what form those institutions take. What would the institutions look like? And this is the normative or prescriptive part of economics. It's a part of welfare economics. Okay, well, that's a rather abstract way of telling you what mechanism design is all about. Perhaps it doesn't say very much. So without further ado, why don't I go to an example? It's perhaps an example that you will find too simple, but don't worry, there are some more complicated examples after that. But let's start with a simple example. And it's an example which may be familiar to you from your own home experience. It's one that takes place in many homes around the world. Let's imagine that there's a parent, a mother, who has a cake that she wants to divide between her two children, Alice and Bob. And her goal is to make sure that each child is happy with the piece that he or she gets. And again, if you've had this experience in your own home, you know it's very important that each child be happy. It makes your life miserable if one child is upset. So what has to be the case is that Bob should think that he's got at least half the cake, and Alice should think that she's got at least half the cake. And if this goal is accomplished, we say that we have a fair division. So that's the goal. And the question is how to achieve this goal. Well, if it so happens that the mother knows that she views the cake the same way that the children do, then there's a very simple resolution to the problem. She can take a knife and cut the cake exactly equally from her point of view and give each kid a piece. And she knows that since she thinks that the cake has been cut equally, the children will agree, and that will be the end of the story. Each will have half the cake. The problem is, what if the children don't see the cake the same way? And again, from personal experience, I can say the children never see the cake the same way as their parents. So it's entirely possible that the mother will think that she's cut the cake equally, but Bob will think that his piece is smaller than Alice's. And that's no good at all. So here's the problem. The mother wants to achieve a fair division, but she doesn't really have enough information to achieve this because she doesn't know how the children will view the cake themselves. And then the mechanism design question becomes, is there a way that she can proceed? Is there a mechanism that she can use which will result in a fair allocation, in a fair division, even though she doesn't know what a fair division is herself, even though she lacks the information to determine what a fair division is? Well, that's the problem, and It turns out that this is a very old problem. It goes back many thousands of years. It's a problem which is in fact described in the Bible. For those of you who remember your Bible, you might remember the passage in which Lot and Abraham are discussing dividing grazing land between the two of them, and they too want to achieve a fair division. So this is very much like the cake problem. In fact, the Bible not only poses the problem, but it also provides the solution. And it's a very simple solution. What the mother should do, and now let me go back to the cake framework, what the mother should do is to have one of the children say, Bob, cut the cake, and the other child, Alice, choose which piece she wants for herself. Now, I claim that this will solve the problem, and here's why. When Bob cuts the cake, he has a strong incentive to cut it so that the pieces are exactly equal in his eyes. Why? Because if he doesn't, if one of the pieces is bigger than the other, he knows that Alice is going to take that one, and he'll be left with the smaller piece. So he has an incentive to cut the cake so that no matter which piece Alice takes, he's happy with the one that's left. So he'll be happy, and Alice will be happy because she gets to choose her favorite piece between the two. So that's the solution to the problem. And in fact, it has a well-known label. It's called the divide and choose method. And perhaps you've used it yourself because it's well known. So it's a very simple problem. Yet it already is rich enough to exhibit some of the essential features of mechanism design theory. The key feature here is that the mechanism designer herself, the mother, doesn't have enough information in advance to know which outcome is optimal, and therefore she has to proceed indirectly through this mechanism. In the cake case, it was the divide and choose mechanism. And what happens is that the mechanism itself generates the information necessary to achieve a fair division. Now, there's a complication. And the complication is that the participants, Alice and Bob in the mechanism, don't necessarily share the mother's goals. The mother wants to achieve a fair division. Alice and Bob couldn't care less about a fair division. They just want more cake. Alice wants more cake. Bob wants more cake. They're greedy. I mean, that's okay. Children do tend to be greedy. But it complicates the problem because their own objectives have to be taken into account by the mechanism designer when constructing the mechanism. In other words, the mechanism must be incentive compatible. Okay, well, that's the first example. And you might say, well, is that all mechanism design is good for? Cutting cakes? It is good for cutting cakes, but actually it can be used for other things too. And so let me go on to a second example, which perhaps has greater economic significance, and that's the problem of privatization. So you're possibly aware that over the last 15 years, there's been a great privatization of the radio spectrum in many countries of the world. It used to be that the right to broadcast on radio frequencies was owned by the government. But it was recognized that this was inefficient because this radio spectrum could be put to good economic and social use if it were controlled privately, in particular if it were controlled by the telecom companies, which were interested in getting hold of it and which were interested in using it for mobile phones. I heard one a moment ago, for Blackberries, for satellite television, for all of the many marvelous new innovations that have been made possible by the privatization of the radio spectrum. So let's look at an example of privatization. Imagine that the government has a license which it wants to sell or privatize, and there are a number of telecom companies, there are a number of telecom companies interested in this license. What the government wants to do, we'll suppose, is to put this license into the hands of the company that is going to value it the most, because that company is likely to make the most productive use of the license, is likely to create the most social value. This is what we would call the efficient outcome. So the government wants to achieve an efficient outcome by privatizing this license. The problem is that the government doesn't know which company attaches the highest value to the license. That's private information. That's known to the individual companies, but not to the government. So how can it proceed? How can it actually do the privatizing? Well, the obvious mechanism is for the government to go around and ask each company, how much do you value the license, and then give it to the company that values it the most according to what it says. The problem is that if companies realize that what they say is going to affect the probability of actually getting the license, they have an incentive to exaggerate what they say, because the higher number the company says, the higher the probability that it's actually going to get the license. So companies will all inflate their evaluations, and then the government will have no idea which company really has the highest value. So that's not likely to work very well. It's just too naive or too simplistic a mechanism. So the government could try something a little bit more sophisticated. The government could have each company make a bid for the license. A bid just means a statement of how much you are willing to pay for the license, and award the license to the high bidder, and then have the high bidder, the winning bidder, pay its bid. Well, this is certainly going to eliminate overstatements. Companies will no longer exaggerate their bids, because if a company exaggerates and wins, it's going to pay more for the license than the license is worth to it. So it's not going to exaggerate. The problem is that now companies have an incentive to understate, to say that the license is worth less than it really is. And this is quite easy to see. Imagine that you're a company, Telemax, and that the license is worth 10 million to you. Well, would you actually bid 10 million? if you did bid 10 million and you won, you would be getting something worth 10 million, you would be getting the license, but you would be paying 10 million, you would have to pay your bid, so you would end up with a net profit of 0. Well, if your profit is 0, you might as well not even bother trying to get the license. You're better off, you might as well just stay home. So you're not going to bid 10 million, you're going to bid something less than 10 million. That means that your chance of winning the license might not be as high anymore, but at least if you do win, you will have a positive profit. So all the companies will understate, but if all the companies are understating, then once again, the government will have a hard time identifying the company that actually has the highest value. So this mechanism won't work either. What will work? Is there a mechanism that strikes a balance between overstating and understating so that companies bid exactly what the license is worth to them? Well, some of you may know the answer to this because it too is a famous mechanism, and it looks like this. Once again, each company makes a bid for the license, and once again, the winning bidder is the high bidder, but now instead of paying its own bid, it pays the second highest bid. That one little twist makes all the difference. And so just to make sure that the mechanism is clear, imagine that there are 3 bidders, and one of them bids 10 million, another bids 8 million, a third bids 5 million. Then the winning bidder will be the 10 million bidder, but it will pay 8 million because that's the second highest bid. So that's how the mechanism works, and I claim that this will solve the government's problem. Now it will indeed sell the license to the right bidder, the bidder with the highest value. Now why is that? Well, first let me try to persuade you that companies no longer have an incentive to understate. If a company understates, it doesn't gain anything from doing that because it doesn't pay its bid anyway. So if you're Telemax and it's worth 10 million to you and you bid 9 million, well, if the second highest bid is 8 million, you win either way. You could bid 10 million, you could bid 9 million. In both cases you win. And in both cases, you pay 8 million. So the understatement doesn't reduce your payment at all. Furthermore, if you underbid, you run the risk of losing the license altogether. Say Telemax bids 7 million, but some other company bids 8 million. Well, now Telemax will lose the license. It will be outbid. If it had bid 10 million, it would have won, and it would have had a nice 2 million profit, 10 million minus 8 million. So underbidding is never advantageous, and furthermore, it runs the risk of losing the license altogether. So you don't want to underbid in this kind of mechanism. Similarly, you don't want to overbid. You don't want to overstate because, again, it's never going to be advantageous to overbid. If the second highest bid is 8 million and you bid 12 million rather than 10 million, you'll win either way, 10 million or 12 million, and you'll pay 8 million. In both cases. So bidding 12 million doesn't have any advantage. Furthermore, you run the risk of overpaying because now if you bid 12 million and there's another company that bids 11 million, well, you will win, but you will end up paying 11 million, and that's a higher figure than the license is actually worth to you. It's worth 10 million to you. So by overbidding, you might end up paying too much. So you don't want to overbid either. And that means that the only thing left is to actually bid exactly what the license is worth to you. And if companies realize this, if they go through the kind of logic that I just went through, they will bid what the license is worth to them, and therefore the winner will be the company with the highest value, which is just what the government wanted in the first place, even though the government didn't know which company that was. So this is, again, a very clever and very economically important example of mechanism design in action. This kind of logic was very important in the designing the auctions, the selling procedures that have actually been used in privatizing the radio spectrum. Okay, so that's our second example. Let me look at one more example, and then I will wind up. And this final example is going to be an energy example. So let's imagine there are that we have a society with it's a very small society. It'll just consist of two people. We'll bring back our friends Alice and Bob to populate the society. And Alice and Bob are consumers of energy. There's also an energy authority which is going to choose a source of energy from which Alice and Bob will get all of their energy needs. They will satisfy all their energy needs from this public energy source. And let's suppose that there are 4 alternatives that the energy authority could choose from. It can only choose one of these. It would be too expensive to have 2 different kinds of energy. But the 4 it considers are first gas, oil, nuclear power, and coal. And of course, what it would like to do is to choose an energy source which is good from the point of view of the consumers, Alice and Bob. But the whole difficulty is that the energy authority doesn't know what Alice and Bob actually want. Let's imagine that there are 2 possibilities. I'm going to look at a very simple example. Let's suppose that there are just 2 possibilities for what Alice and Bob might want. We'll call them 2 states of the world. In one state of the world, the first state, we'll suppose that Alice and Bob care mostly about their current consumption. They don't put too much weight on the future. And in the other states, state 2, they put most of their weight on future consumption, not so much on the present. Now, how does that translate into their views on energy? Well, we'll imagine that Alice, when consuming energy, cares mostly about how convenient it is to use. So that means that in state 1, where she's putting most of the weight on current consumption, she likes gas the most because that's the easiest to use, then oil, then coal, and nuclear power comes last because that's the most cumbersome. In state 2, where she's looking ahead to the future and she cares about future consumption, now nuclear power comes up at the top because she anticipates that there are going to be technological breakthroughs which make nuclear power much easier to use in the future. We'll suppose that Bob in contrast, cares mostly about how safe the energy is. So in state one, he puts nuclear up at the top. He feels that's the safest. Oil is next, then coal. Gas is down at the bottom because he's worried about gas explosions. He's worried about his oven blowing up. In state two, where he's looking ahead to the future, now nuclear goes down to the bottom because he is worried about the long-term problem of getting rid of nuclear waste. So really all I've been doing is telling you a story about why Alice and Bob have the particular preferences they do in the two states, and I've summarized their preferences here. So in state one, these are Alice's preferences. Alice puts gas up at the top, then oil, coal, nuclear is down at the bottom, and similarly for Bob, and similarly for state two. And what the Energy Authority would like to do is to choose an energy source which takes into account both what Alice wants and what Bob wants. Let's say the Energy Authority would like to compromise between what Alice wants and what Bob wants. So that suggests that in state one, oil might be a good choice because, well, gas is not a good choice because although Alice likes gas in state one, Bob doesn't like gas at all. And although Bob likes nuclear power, Alice doesn't like nuclear power at all. So gas and nuclear are not a good choice. And coal's not a good choice because both Alice and Bob prefer oil to coal. So that leaves oil as the right compromise in state one. And similarly, gas is the right compromise in state two. I've set up this example so that state one and state two are very symmetric. So basically anything I say about state one can be translated into a similar statement about state two. The problem, of course, is that the authority doesn't know Alice and Bob's preferences. It doesn't know the state. It doesn't know whether this is true or this is true. So it doesn't know whether to choose oil or gas. Now, how can it solve this problem? Well, again, the most straightforward mechanism would be for the authority to just go ahead and ask Alice and Bob, what is the state? What are your preferences? The problem is that this would give Alice an incentive to say that state two is the states, even though state one is the actual states. Now, to see that, notice that in both state one and state two, Alice prefers gas to oil. You see in state one, Alice puts gas above oil, and in state two, Alice puts gas above oil. And she knows that if the authority thinks that state two is the actual state, the authority will choose gas, which she prefers to oil. So she's going to say state two, even if state one is the actual state. Bob is going to do just the opposite. He has the incentive always to say state one, because he always prefers oil to gas. Notice that in state one, Bob prefers oil to gas, and in state two, Bob prefers oil to gas. So what will happen if the authority goes to Alice and Bob and says, what is the state? Well, Alice will say state two, Bob will say state one, and the authority will have no idea what the actual state is. So that mechanism won't work. It's too naive. Well, what mechanism will work? And I wouldn't be showing you this example unless there happened to be a mechanism that worked, and here's one that does. It's given by this little table, and probably many of you have seen some game theory. This can be thought of as a game played between Alice and Bob, where Alice chooses rows, those are her choices, and Bob chooses columns. So Alice can choose top or bottom row, Bob can choose left or right column, and the outcome is just determined by the intersection of their choices. So if Alice chooses the bottom row and Bob chooses the right column, the outcome will be gas. And I claim that this mechanism will solve the problem. That is, it will result in oil in state 1 and gas in state 2. Let's see why that's so. Let's imagine that state 1 is the actual state, and let's see what Alice and Bob would do in state 1. Well, if Alice anticipates that Bob will play the left column, then Alice will want to choose the top row, because if she chooses top, she gets oil. If she chooses bottom, she gets nuclear power. And notice that in state 1, Alice prefers oil to nuclear power, so she will indeed choose the top row if she thinks Bob is going to go left. Furthermore, Bob will choose left, or at least he has a strong incentive to go left, because regardless of what Alice does, Bob is better off going left. If Alice chooses the top row and Bob goes left, he gets oil. If he goes right, he gets coal. But notice that in state 1, Bob prefers oil to coal. If Alice chooses the bottom row, if Bob goes left, he gets nuclear power. If he goes right, he gets gas. But notice that Bob prefers nuclear power to gas. So in both cases, he will go left. So in the language of game theory, Alice choosing top, Bob going left, is a Nash equilibrium. Neither player has an incentive to deviate from their choice. And in fact, it's not hard to verify that Alice playing top, Bob playing left is the only Nash equilibrium in state 1. So it's a good prediction of what will actually happen if Alice and Bob play this game, and if Alice and Bob are capable of choosing in a way that advances their own personal objectives. But notice that if Alice chooses top and Bob goes left, we get oil, which is the right choice in state 1. So we've implemented the right choice in state 1. Well, I could go through the analysis for state 2, but I'm not going to even bother, because as I said, I've constructed state 2 to be symmetric with state 1. So just as I argued that in state 1, Alice would go top, Bob would go left, by a very similar argument, we'll expect that in state 2, Alice will play the bottom strategy, Bob will play the right strategy, and we'll get gas, which is optimal in state 2. So in both states, we get the right outcome, even though the mechanism designer didn't know the state, and even though Alice and Bob weren't interested in getting a compromise, the mechanism designer wanted to get a compromise, Alice and Bob just want to get the energy source that's good for them individually. And we say that this mechanism implements the designer's goals. The goal is to get oil in state 1, gas in state 2. Okay, so I've given you these three examples, the cake, the telecom, and the energy examples. You might complain that all of this seems a little bit too contrived, a little bit too ad hoc. You might ask, and I certainly would agree with you, whether it would be possible to get a more general analysis. So what kinds of general questions might we ask? We might ask, is there a general way of determining whether or not a goal is implementable? In the three examples I showed you, it turned out that the designer's goal was implementable. But in fact, there are plenty of cases, sadly, where there's no mechanism that can be found which would implement a designer's goals. But if the goal is implementable, we might ask, is there a procedure we can follow, an algorithm perhaps that we can use, which would identify a mechanism that implements the goal? Well, it turns out that the answer is yes to both questions. Don't worry, I'm not going to go through the analysis today, but if you are interested, I'd refer you to this old paper of mine, which attempts to show why the answer is yes to both questions. And there's been a lot of work since then which generalizes and extends and refines the answer. What I do want to say, though, in conclusion today, is that although mechanism design now has been around for many years, in fact, the creator of mechanism design, Leo Hurwicz, Alejandro mentioned Leo Hurwicz in his introduction, the first papers that Leo Hurwicz wrote on mechanism design came out almost 50 years ago. Leo Hurwicz's first paper on the subject was published in 1960. So the subject has been around for a long time, but there's a sense in which some of its most important applications are still out there, waiting for you to solve. And let me mention two of them. And here they are. I'll take them one by one. We're all aware that the Earth is heating up, that the Earth's atmosphere is heating up, and we also know the reason why. It's because we're putting greenhouse gases, in particular carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere. And we also know that if we continue to allow this to happen unchecked, that it could lead to catastrophic results, not tomorrow, but maybe 40, 50 years from now. So there's an obvious social goal that we want to, that most of us want to achieve, and that is to reduce the emissions of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. The problem is that that social goal is in conflict with the individual goals of the countries around the world. Each country would like all the other countries to reduce their carbon emissions, but it would prefer not to do so itself because reducing carbon is expensive. It has an economic cost. It means adopting new technologies, or it means reducing output, or it means shutting down factories. All of this is expensive, and therefore there's a conflict, just as in the three examples I already showed you, between social goals and private incentives. How do we reconcile that conflict, we do so through an international treaty. A properly designed international treaty will induce each country to sign that treaty, even though it has its own agenda. A properly designed international treaty will give each country enough to gain from having the treaty go through that it will be willing to compromise a bit in order to see the treaty succeed. Well, a treaty is just a mechanism. It's exactly a mechanism in our mechanism design language, and designing a workable international treaty is an exercise in mechanism design theory. Now, I don't have the solution to show you today, but the next time I come here, I expect one of you to show me the solution, because this is an important, outstanding problem. Another important, outstanding problem is stopping financial crises. Now, how do we do that? Well, we're still in the midst of the current financial crisis. This crisis was caused by a failure of government regulation. It was caused because there was a conflict between the private goals of banks, which was to make as much money as possible, and the social goal that we all share of having a stable and workable financial system. As we saw very clearly, those two goals are in conflict, and the way that we reconcile those two goals is through a mechanism of regulation, that is, putting limits on what banks and other financial institutions can do. Now, exactly what that financial mechanism should look like, again, I don't have the answer to today, but I imagine that many of you might be participating in that answer in the years to come. But for now, I'd simply like to thank you for your attention. It was a pleasure having the chance to tell you about mechanism design theory. Many thanks.
Bueno, el doctor Maskin ha accedido a contestar 3 preguntas del público. Nuestros compañeros están ahí con los micrófonos.
Bueno, is there anyone to translate my question? You? Okay, profesor Maskin, usted ha mencionado que la teoría de implementación puede decirnos si cierto goal social puede ser implementado por un mecanismo. Y si la respuesta es sí, también nos dice cómo puede ser implementado. Pero, ¿existe investigación sobre el espacio de mecanismos disponibles, de forma que pudiéramos estudiar los mecanismos disponibles en sí mismos, en lugar de intentar esperar a formular la pregunta correcta para que la teoría de la implementación nos conteste si existe el mecanismo correcto?
Okay, so if I understand your question correctly, you want me to comment on classical mechanisms, say the market. You can think of the market itself as a mechanism. Of course it is, because if we have a free market, The participants are just the buyers and sellers in that market, and their collective action results in an outcome. And that is a mechanism in precisely the same sense that I've been talking. In fact, I should say that Leo Hurwicz got into mechanism design theory precisely himself. In fact, he created the field precisely because he was interested in a debate, a very interesting debate that took place about markets back in the 1930s between two groups of very interesting economists. On the one hand, there was a group following Abba Lerner and Oscar Lange, who argued that the market mechanism gave rise to too many market failures. In fact, we know that there are many goods, such as public goods, which are not well provided by markets at all. Also, markets where there are important externalities do not deliver good outcomes. And so Lange and Lerner argued that we should do everything by central planning. This was an intellectual argument for a centrally planned or a socialist scheme, because at the very worst, a centrally planned scheme could replicate what the market did, and in cases of market failure, it could do strictly better. In strong opposition to what Lange and Lerner were saying, Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich von Hayek said that central planning was absolutely hopeless as an idea because it would require too much information. And furthermore, it would require information that the central planner could never get. In order for the central planner to be able to calculate an optimal allocation, it would have to know citizens' preferences. But as we saw in the Alice and Bob examples, citizens don't always have the incentive to provide their preferences in a non-manipulated way. And von Mises and von Hayek recognized that. And that more or less killed the Lange-Lerner argument for centralized planning. And in fact, we saw just a very practical example of how badly central planning works when the Soviet Union collapsed. Nevertheless, the arguments between Lange and Lerner and Hayek and von Mises was a very interesting one intellectually, and Hurwicz was very interested in the question of whether, in the cases where there are market failures, are there mechanisms which can do better than the market? Or are there cases where there are mechanisms which can economize on information? I mean, the markets, as Hayek and von Mises pointed out, does economize on information, because I as a buyer and you as a seller don't have to know what everybody else's preferences are. That's very economical. But perhaps, Hurwicz asked, there are mechanisms which are even better. And so he thought of mechanism design as a general way of analyzing mechanisms, including the classical mechanisms like the market mechanism. Well, that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but I hope it suggests that this field didn't just come out of nowhere. It was directly inspired by an important intellectual debate about a classical mechanism, the market.
Gracias.
Creo que aquí adelante tienen una pregunta.
It certainly is an honor to have you here, Dr. Maskin. And you mentioned two potential applications for this mechanism. I was wondering, I mean, I don't know how familiar you are with Mexico's current situation, but if you could give us a few examples of this model for Mexico as a third world country that is trying to get out of this very deep economic crisis with problems such as poverty and, well, you know, all these problems.
Yep. Actually, one particular question that I have been working on myself in collaboration with Michael Kramer, who's an economist at Harvard, is why is it the case that in many developing countries around the world, globalization, which has increased average incomes in many developing countries, has at the same time caused a greater gap between rich and poor. It tends to be people at the upper end of the income scale who have gained the most from globalization, and people down at the bottom have tended to be left behind, or actually even made worse off as a result of globalization. So that's an important theoretical question. Why has this happened? And we have an answer, which I'm not going to go into today because it would be a separate talk. But we have an answer to that puzzle. But we also have a mechanism design issue, which is, well, accepting that this has happened, is there anything we can do about it? So what kinds of mechanisms could we put in place which would help correct for the increasing inequality? And the particular mechanism that we have in mind is training. That is, in our theory, the reason for this increasing gap between rich and poor is that people down at the bottom don't have any useful skills to sell in the global marketplace. And the answer to that difficulty is to create a mechanism whereby they would get those skills. Now, how do you do that? Well, the problem is that these workers can't acquire the skills on their own. They're too poor. They can't afford the training that it would take. Private companies don't always have the incentive to train these workers, because if you train me so that I now have more skills, I don't necessarily have to work for you. I could go work for your competitor, and then your investment in me will have been lost. So a clever mechanism, or a mechanism which gets around this problem, is an incentive scheme that the government gives companies. It's in effect a subsidy scheme whereby it gives companies a bit of money for, in return, training workers to have skills which will be useful on the global marketplace. That's a mechanism design question which could possibly even be relevant here in Mexico.
Una última pregunta.
Bueno. Well, yeah, it is a pleasure to have you here, Doctor. And a question goes about the Nobel Prize. Personally, did it take you by surprise Was it something that you guys thought, well, we're going for the Nobel, and in your case, once you received it, what do you think it takes to win such a prize? And what is the responsibilities? What are some of the responsibilities that go with it?
Okay. First of all, it was a surprise. It was a surprise in the following sense. There are lots of people out there who have done superb work in economics. All of them are deserving of recognition. I'm glad that it turned out that our work was deserving of recognition too, but it was more, I think it was more or less a lottery that we happened to win. And I'm not complaining about winning, but I certainly didn't count on it. And in fact, it's my view that as an incentive scheme, the Nobel Prize is not actually very good. And the reason why it's not very good is that if you rationally calculate your chance of winning, it's pretty small. It should not change your behavior very much to know that there's a minuscule chance that you might win some prize. Furthermore, even if you did have a good chance of winning, I'm not sure that it would change your incentives in the right way, because if you're trying to win a prize, what your thinking gets distorted. What you're trying to do is to figure out what somebody else is going to think is important, rather than working on what you think is important. But in fact, the whole reason for going into academic research in the first place, I mean, certainly it doesn't pay very well. The main reason for doing it is because it gives you freedom. It gives you the freedom to work on exactly what you think is interesting, and never mind what other people think is interesting. So I don't think prizes provide a very good incentive scheme for basic research. Nevertheless, I do think that they serve a useful social purpose, not for the people who actually win, but for the world, because some of these prizes, and the Nobel Prize is probably the best known, take what is sometimes rather intricate, complicated work, which is known only to specialists in the fields, and allow and give the winners a world platform to tell ordinary citizens about it. I have had the chance in the last 2 years to talk about mechanism design to an amazing variety of audiences. I've talked to young school children. Trying to keep their interest is hard, so I concentrate on the cake example. I've talked to government officials. I've talked to retired people. They're interested in pension schemes as an incentive scheme, as a mechanism. Many different audiences, and I've enjoyed the opportunity, and I felt the responsibility of telling them about what I think are important ideas, which they otherwise wouldn't know about. So that, I think, is the responsibility that a prize like this gives to people like me. It's not a responsibility that I resent. It's been fun, but I think that's really the only important good effect of a Nobel Prize or some other kind of prize.
Thank you very much, Dr. Maskin. Once again, it was a pleasure to have you here with us. Un aplauso, por favor, para el Dr. Maskin por acompañarnos esta tarde, por favor. Igualmente quiero agradecer nuevamente a Mario por traer tanta gente de calidad aquí al ITAM y por contribuir al desarrollo del ITAMITA y contribuir en gran medida a la misión de esta gran institución. Un aplauso, por favor, para Mario. De igual manera, antes de que se vayan, sé que muchos tienen eco el sábado. Para los que no tienen eco, por supuesto, los invito el viernes a las 9 de la mañana. El doctor Edmund Phelps va a estar en el Palacio de Minería, en el Centro Histórico, como parte del programa de la Semana de Ciencia e Innovación que organiza el Gobierno del Distrito Federal. Entonces, quien esté interesado, la representación de Economía hará una visita. Si gustan, acérquense con nosotros, mándenos un mail o visiten la página, que es muy dinámica. De parte del Departamento de Economía del ITAM, le entregamos un reconocimiento al doctor Eric Maskin, así como de parte de la representación de Economía.
It's a little box made of Mexican silver, so you can keep your Nobel Prize medal in it.